Pick up your money, old man. That is what Julian Vance said, his voice cutting across the intersection of Oak and Fifth, loud enough for every driver and pedestrian within 30 feet to freeze in place. He had just run a red light, folded the front end of his red sports car into an old brown sedan, and his first instinct was to rip a stack of hundreds from his jacket and throw them directly into the face of the quiet black man behind the wheel. The bills scattered across the dusty dashboard. The older man, calm, unhurried, unreadable, did not reach for a single one. He looked at Julian with steady, dark eyes, said nothing, and slowly reached into his own jacket. Julian laughed. The man pulled out a phone, not a wallet, and pressed record. 22 people watched. Not one moved. Julian kept screaming. The man kept recording. He already knew exactly where this recording was going to end up.
Absolute madness. He just handed the ultimate weapon to the exact man. Controls his freedom. Let's watch his downfall.
Marcus Thorne didn't grow up with money. He grew up with something rarer. A father who understood one thing clearly. A man's worth had nothing to do with what he drove, what he wore, or what he owned. It had everything to do with how he carried himself. The world tried to strip those things away. He remembered the way his father, Earl Thorne, used to grip the steering wheel of that old brown sedan. Not tightly, not with the white-knuckled anxiety of a man afraid of losing something, but loosely, almost tenderly, the way a person holds something they genuinely love. Earl had bought that car second-hand in 1991. He paid for it in cash. He had saved over 18 months of double shifts at the rail yard. He treated it with a quiet, dignified pride that money couldn't manufacture. A man who respects what little he has. Earl used to say, eyes steady on the road ahead, will know exactly what to do when he gets a whole lot more. Marcus had taken that sentence into every courtroom he'd ever walked into. He was 11 years old the first time someone called him something ugly from a car window. He and Earl had been walking home from the hardware store. It was a Saturday afternoon errand. Marcus had complained about it all morning. He remembered the exact quality of the light. Golden, lazy, late summer. He remembered the way the word hit the air. He hadn't yet fully understood what it meant. He felt it before he processed it. A cold, sickening drop somewhere in his stomach. His small hands had balled into fists automatically. Earl's hand came down on his shoulder, not to restrain him, not out of fear. It was a slow, deliberate gesture, firm and warm. It said everything without saying anything at all. Earl hadn't screamed after the car. He hadn't crumbled. He had simply looked down at his son with an expression Marcus would spend the rest of his life trying to decode, a look caught somewhere between sorrow and absolute unshakable certainty. Something between sorrow and absolute unshakable certainty. Don't let that boy's ignorance live inside you, Earl said quietly. The second you carry their ugliness, it starts to feel like yours. Marcus hadn't fully understood it then. He did now. 40 years later, Marcus sat in that battered sedan at the intersection of Oak and Fifth. His heart was still beating steadily. The crash hadn't changed that. The humiliation raining down from the mouth of a screaming 21-year-old hadn't changed it either. The young man smelled like expensive cologne and fresh entitlement. Marcus understood it all completely. He sat very still. He let the $100 bills flutter against his face. They fell into his lap like autumn leaves, weightless and meaningless. He let Julian Vance's voice wash over him, loud, vicious, utterly certain of its own power. And he thought about Earl. His father had died in that same sedan, not dramatically, not in a crash or an emergency. Earl Thorne had died on a quiet Tuesday morning in March 11 years ago. He was parked in the driveway of the modest house Marcus had bought him after his first successful prosecution had made the evening news. Earl had simply sat down behind the wheel the way he always did. He hadn't gotten back up. The doctor said it was his heart. Marcus had always thought it was something more deliberate than that, like his father had simply decided he was finished. He had chosen the one place that felt most like himself to let go. Marcus had been handed the car keys at the funeral. He hadn't been able to explain to anyone why he'd started driving it on weekends. His colleagues found it baffling. His ex-wife had found it embarrassing. His driver Rodriguez had once gently suggested that perhaps the chief prosecutor of the district might consider a vehicle that reflected his position. Marcus had smiled, said it does. What it reflected was the thing Julian Vance had never been taught to see. While Julian was still raging at the window, his voice scaling upward with each new insult, the small crowd of bystanders shuffled at a careful distance. Marcus let his right hand drop slowly to his jacket pocket. His fingers found the smooth edge of his phone. He had been carrying it in the same pocket since the morning. It was an old habit, a holdover from his years as an assistant DA. He had learned early that the difference between a case, a conviction, was often a single, unimpeachable piece of evidence. It had to be captured at exactly the right moment. He pressed record without looking down. His face remained still. His breathing remained even. His eyes held Julian's with the same quiet, opaque patience he used on witnesses. Didn't yet know they were already caught. A kind of stillness that wasn't passivity, but rather the deep, practiced composure of a man. Had long ago stopped confusing silence for surrender. Julian didn't notice. Julian never noticed things that weren't about Julian. "You think anyone in this city is going to believe you over me?" Julian shouted, gesturing wildly to the gathering witnesses. Almost universally, they were averting their eyes. They had the uncomfortable body language of people. Know they are watching something wrong. They hadn't yet decided what to do about it. "My father owns half the buildings on this street. I went to school with the mayor's son. I have the Chief Prosecutor's office on speed dial." He laughed. It was a sharp, contemptuous sound, the laugh of someone. Had never once been told no by a consequence that actually stuck. "I could have you arrested right now just for being in my way." The phone in Marcus's pocket was capturing every syllable in clean, damning audio. He thought of Earl again. Earl, who had spent 31 years working for men exactly like Julian Vance's father. Not in real estate, but in the rail yards, in the supply warehouses, in the invisible infrastructure of a city that ran on the labor of men whose names never appeared in the newspaper. Earl had never been bitter about it. That was the thing Marcus had found most remarkable, most confounding about his father. There was no bitterness. There was pride and there was patience. There was an almost architectural sense of self that no one from the outside had ever managed to dislodge. "They can take a lot of things." Earl had told him once the summer Marcus had come home from his first year of law school, burning with righteous fury over a case he'd read about in his criminal procedure textbook. "They can take your job, your car, your dignity, or they'll try to. But they cannot take what you know about yourself, not one bit of it. And what you know about yourself is the only thing that will ever actually protect you." Marcus had built a career on that sentence. He had built it in rooms where people expected him to fail. He had built it through 18-hour days in underfunded offices with overflowing caseloads. He had built it through years of watching guilty men walk free because of money connections or the kind of casual institutional indifference that doesn't need a name to do its damage. He had built it through every moment someone had looked at him, seen the wrong thing. He had built it by never letting their vision of him replace his own, not once. The recording ran for 4 minutes and 38 seconds. Julian Vance finally exhausted himself. He straightened his jacket. He shot Marcus one last look of scalding contempt. He turned back to his gleaming red sports car with its crumpled front panel. He climbed in with the easy, careless grace of someone has never had to account for the damage he leaves behind. The engine roared to life with obscene authority. The car screeched away from the intersection, leaving behind the smell of burning rubber. Scattered money. Marcus sat quietly for a long moment. He bent down. He gathered the bills from his lap one at a time. He smoothed them carefully. He folded them into his breast pocket, not because he needed them, because they were evidence. Then he reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror. It was an old habit Earl had instilled in him before he'd ever legally been allowed behind the wheel. He looked at his own reflection for exactly 1 second. He looked calm. He looked patient. He looked like a man, had just been handed everything he needed. He pulled out his phone. He checked that the recording had saved cleanly. He set it in the cup holder where he could see it. Then Marcus Thorne started the engine of his father's old sedan. He checked his mirrors the way Earl had taught him. He drove away from the intersection without once looking back. The recording stayed in his pocket for 3 weeks. Marcus didn't listen to it again. He didn't need to. Every word Julian Vance had screamed into the afternoon air at that intersection had settled into his memory with the clean, permanent clarity of a court transcript. Verbatim, unembellished, exactly as damning as it had been in the moment it was spoken. That was the thing about men like Julian. They never said anything they didn't mean. They just usually said it in rooms where no one was recording. He went back to work on Monday morning the same way he always did. Rodriguez picked him up at 7:15. He had a double espresso from the cart outside the building. He read the overnight case summaries on the elevator ride up. He was at his desk by 7:40 with his jacket still on. His assistant Diane set a fresh legal pad in front of him at 8 o'clock sharp without being asked. She had been doing it every morning for 6 years. She understood by now that Marcus Thorne operated on precision. Consistency, the way most people operated on caffeine. Nobody at the office knew about the incident at Oak and Fifth. Marcus hadn't told anyone. He had, however, quietly pulled Julian Vance's file. It wasn't difficult to find. The Vance name had appeared in the district's peripheral orbit more than once over the years. A noise complaint at a luxury property handled swiftly and without consequence. A minor traffic citation from 2 years prior dismissed on procedural grounds that struck Marcus as convenient rather than legitimate. A civil suit filed by a former employee of Vance Properties settled out of court under a non-disclosure agreement so airtight it might as well have been poured from concrete. Nothing that had ever made it to Marcus's desk directly. Nothing that had ever needed to. The pattern, though, was familiar. Marcus had seen it 100 times. Not criminality so much as impunity. The slow, comfortable accumulation of a young man. Had learned very early that consequences were negotiable. That rules were architecture built for other people, that the most reliable tool in any difficult situation was a check written in a large enough denomination to make the problem disappear. He read the file once. He closed it. He put it in the bottom left drawer of his desk. Then he waited. He didn't have to wait long. The call came on a Thursday night 3 weeks, 2 days after the crash. It came not to Marcus directly, to the general intake line of the district prosecutor's office. It was flagged. Routed to his desk by the duty coordinator with a 2-word note attached: Vance. Again. The details were straightforward and ugly. Julian Vance, at approximately 11:40 p.m., had been observed by multiple witnesses driving his vehicle at high speed through the Meridian district. It was a red customized sports car, the same one the replacement panel not yet fully color matched. He struck a 34-year-old woman named Carla Reyes at a pedestrian crossing. She had been walking home from a late shift. She was carrying groceries. Julian had not stopped. He had been apprehended 6 blocks away, partially because someone at the scene had photographed his plate, posted it before the police had even arrived, partially because Julian, apparently having processed the situation, determined it manageable, had actually called his own attorney from the car before calling anyone else. He was cooperative at the scene of the arrest in the specific performative way of someone has been arrested before. He understood that the optics of the moment matter. Calm, almost bored. He asked twice about when he could expect bail to be processed. Carla Reyes was in surgery for 4 hours. She lost partial mobility in her left hand. She would not return to her job as a home health aide for 6 months. Marcus read the report at his kitchen table at midnight. He read it slowly. Then he set it down. He sat for a while in the particular silence that settles over a room. Something that has been moving toward its conclusion finally arrives. It wasn't angry. Anger was a fuel he'd learned to burn efficiently and without waste. This situation didn't require it. What it required was precision. Precision was something Marcus Thorne had in abundance. He picked up the report. He read it again. By the next morning, the Vance family's response was already in motion. It had the familiar choreography of wealth managing inconvenience. A brief, carefully worded statement from Vance Properties expressing concern for the injured party. A wire transfer to an account Marcus knew from experience would be associated with attorney Harlan Sterling. A quiet, informal call placed to one of the assistant DAs in Marcus's office by someone. Identified themselves as a representative of the Vance family's legal team inquiring about the possibility of an expedited resolution. The assistant DA had taken careful notes. Brought them directly to Marcus without responding. Marcus read the notes. He thought about Earl. He thought about Carla Reyes, 34 years old, groceries in her arms, walking home from a late shift at the hour of the night. The city was supposed to be safe for people who worked hard and asked for nothing extraordinary in return. I thought about the recording sitting in his phone. He had backed up to 3 separate locations the week after the crash. He was a thorough man. He had not gotten this far in his career by leaving things to chance. He picked up his pen, wrote 2 words at the bottom of the assistant DA's notes, "No deals." Then he circled them. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Sterling's office had requested it framed in the formal, courteous language of professional negotiation, a preliminary discussion regarding the matter of Julian Vance, an opportunity to review the evidence in a collaborative spirit, a chance to explore what Sterling's letter called mutually constructive pathways to resolution. It was the language of a man who charged $400 an hour, had never once in his career walked into a room without believing he would walk out of it having gotten what he came for. Marcus confirmed the meeting time through Diane. He specified the elite negotiation room on the 14th floor. He requested that the room be prepared with the standard setup water, a clean legal pad at each seat. The recording system activated and clearly visible on the table as required by protocol. He didn't tell Sterling who would be presiding. That wasn't an oversight. Marcus was not a man who made oversights. It was a deliberate, considered choice made with the same methodical care he brought to every aspect of a case he intended to win completely. He had learned over the course of a long career that the most effective moment to reveal the full weight of a situation was not at the beginning, not in the letter, not in the scheduling call, not at the door, but at the precise instant they were most comfortable, most confident, most thoroughly convinced that the room was already theirs. He wanted Julian Vance settled in that chair. He wanted Sterling mid-sentence. He wanted the full, practiced architecture of their confidence assembled, standing before he walked through that door. Because the thing about a man who had spent 20 years throwing his family's money at his problems was that he had never once had to reckon with a problem that money couldn't reach. He didn't know what that felt like. He had no language for it, no muscle memory, no framework for understanding what it meant to sit across a table from someone, held every card, and didn't need a single thing he had. Marcus was going to teach him. He straightened his jacket, he capped his pen, he went back to work. Julian Vance had never once in his life considered the possibility that a room wouldn't eventually bend without resistance to accommodate him. It wasn't arrogance in the way most people understood arrogance. Not the loud, performative kind that announces itself and demands attention. Julian's was quieter than that, more structural, built so deeply into the architecture of his daily existence that he couldn't have identified it as arrogance any more than a fish could identify water. It was simply the atmosphere he moved through. The world adjusted. The world had always adjusted. And in the 21 years Julian had been alive, there had never been a single sustained moment that suggested it would ever stop doing so. He was at Parallax by 11 o'clock on the night of the accident. Parallax was the kind of club that didn't advertise, didn't maintain a public social media presence, didn't have a sign above the door, just a brushed steel panel and a man in a dark suit, recognized faces rather than checking lists. Julian had been coming here since he was 17 on a guest card attached to his father's membership. The recognition he received from the staff had always carried that specific warmth reserved not for people are liked, but for people whose spending habits are deeply appreciated. He swept past the entrance without breaking stride. He nodded once at the man in the suit, nodded back with practiced deference. Inside the light was the color of expensive bourbon, amber, low and thick. The music moved through the room at a volume calibrated precisely to require leaning in to be heard, created the illusion of intimacy among people who were mostly strangers. Julian found his usual table without being directed to it. A bottle of Cristal arrived within 4 minutes, which was slower than he preferred, faster than the rest of the world managed. He accepted it without comment. His friends that night were the usual constellation. Bryce, whose father ran a hedge fund and laughed at everything Julian said a half-second faster than was natural. Dominic, tall and quiet, present primarily because Julian found his silence useful, and a pair of women whose names Julian had already half forgotten, whose presence served mostly as confirmation that the evening was going well. They arranged themselves around him in the loose gravitational way of people. Understand they are orbiting rather than occupying the center. Julian settled into it with the ease of long habit. "You should have seen his face," Julian said, leaning back, swirling his glass with the comfortable authority of someone retelling a story that has already been curated for maximum effect. "I was talking about the crash, the one at Oak and 5th, 3 weeks ago. He had already told twice in different configurations at different events, and which improved with each telling. Absolute deer in headlights. This ancient brown sedan. I mean, the car was an antique. I probably did him a favor. He just sat there, didn't say a word. I threw about $3,000 in his face. He just sat there collecting it like I was doing him a favor." He laughed. Bryce laughed half a second later, right on schedule. Probably the most money he'd ever seen in one place. Dominic said nothing. One of the women smiled in the way people smile when they're not sure what's funny. Can read the room well enough to know smiling is required. Julian drank. The music shifted. The amber light held everything in its comfortable, consequence-free warmth. Julian Vance felt, as he almost always felt, that the evening was unfolding exactly as evenings were supposed to unfold. He left Parallax at 11:40. He was not sober. He was not in the condition he would later describe to his attorney as entirely composed. He was in the specific state that expensive alcohol produces in people accustomed to expensive alcohol. Functional fluid with the edges of judgment softened just enough to make each decision feel more reasonable than it was. He had declined Bryce's offer to share a car service because the night air felt good. The drive home was only 15 minutes. Julian Vance did not take car services. He had a brand new sports car sitting at the valet. The Meridian district at that hour was quiet in the specific way of city streets between the end of one crowd and the beginning of another. A few lit windows. A delivery truck double parked on the next block. The particular sodium orange glow of streetlights on wet pavement from the earlier rain. Julian drove with one hand on the wheel, his phone balanced on his thigh, scrolling through messages with the divided attention of someone. Has made the calculation, consciously or not, that the road will wait. I didn't see Carla Reyes until he was already through the crossing. He felt the impact before he understood it. A sudden shattering interruption. His body registered it as physical shock before his mind caught up to assign it meaning. In the half-second that followed, Julian's foot found the brake. The car stopped. In the rearview mirror, he could see a shape on the ground. Groceries were scattered across the wet asphalt in a wide, terrible arc. Oranges were rolling slowly toward the gutter in the orange-tinted light.
Pure entitlement. He actually believes his family's wealth can erase a serious crime, like a spilled drink. If I were sitting in that prosecutor's chair, I would be counting the seconds to ruin his day. Imagine walking into a room, expecting a friend, finding your worst enemy. The trap is officially sprung.
Julian explained the situation in the clipped, practical language of someone. Has absorbed through years of proximity to managed consequences the basic architecture of damage control. What to say, what not to say, how to characterize events in their most defensible form before anyone else has the chance to characterize them differently. Sterling listened without interrupting. When Julian finished, Sterling said, "Don't speak to anyone. I'll have someone at the station within the hour." Julian was apprehended 6 blocks from the crossing, cooperative and almost calm. He was operating on the deep, bone-level certainty that this was manageable. He had seen his father manage things of far greater complexity for far lower stakes. He had grown up watching money move through rooms, emerge on the other side as resolution, as silence, as problems that no longer had names. He understood in the abstract that what he had done was serious. I understood it the way you understand the depth of a pool from the edge, conceptually safely without having yet entered the water. At the station, waiting for Sterling's associate to arrive, Julian asked twice about bail processing. Once about whether there was somewhere better he could wait than the current chair, which was plastic and uncomfortable. He spent the night in a holding cell. He slept badly, but he slept. And when Sterling's associate arrived at 6 a.m. with the paperwork, the measured reassurance that the situation was being handled at the highest level. Julian straightened his jacket. He ran a hand through his hair. He walked out of the building into the thin, early morning light with the expression of a man, has been genuinely inconvenienced but has not yet considered the possibility that inconvenience might be the least of what's coming. Sterling had already scheduled the meeting at the district prosecutor's office. Julian was told the chief prosecutor himself would be presiding. Should have given him pause. It didn't. Julian had never met a room he couldn't work. He had never met a powerful man his father's money hadn't eventually reached. He went home. He showered. He had his suit pressed. This level of disrespect is exactly why karma hits so hard. Hit that subscribe button right now if you are ready to see this spoiled brat get entirely humbled. The elevator in the district prosecutor's building rose slowly. Elevators in serious buildings tend to do that, not from mechanical necessity, from a kind of institutional gravity as. The architecture itself understood that the floors above were not to be approached casually. Julian didn't notice. He was checking his reflection in his phone screen. He tilted it slightly to examine the angle of his collar. His valet had pressed that morning to a crispness that bordered on architectural. The suit was Brioni charcoal with a faint window pane check. It had cost more than most people in this building made in a month. That was on some level Julian wouldn't have articulated aloud. Absolutely felt the point. He straightened his cufflinks. Monogrammed platinum, a gift from his father on his 18th birthday. He decided he looked precisely correct for the occasion. Sterling stood beside him, leather briefcase in hand, reviewing something on his phone with the focused, unhurried attention of a man. Had walked into rooms like this one so many times that the ritual of preparation had become entirely automatic. Harlan Sterling was 61 years old, silver-haired with the kind of face that had been handsome in youth. Had since arranged itself into something more useful, authoritative, unreadable. The face of a man who charged what he charged because the alternative was someone, charged less and delivered accordingly. He had practiced law in Cypress City for 34 years. He had in that time negotiated plea deals for 2 sitting city councilmen, a police commissioner. The adult son of a sitting federal judge. He was not a man who lost sleep over difficult rooms. "Relax," Sterling said without looking up from his phone. "I am relaxed," Julian said. Sterling glanced at him briefly with the expression of a man. Has heard that particular sentence delivered in that particular tone enough times to know it means precisely the opposite. He said nothing. He returned to his phone. The elevator opened onto the 14th floor. The hallway was marble. Not the decorative marble of a hotel lobby or a corporate atrium where the stone is primarily a statement about budget, but working marble substantial. Gray vein, the kind that has absorbed decades of footsteps and fluorescent light and the particular silence of consequential decisions being made behind closed doors. The overhead lighting was clean and unsparing. There were no soft edges up here, no design choices aimed at comfort or welcome. The 14th floor of the district prosecutor's office was built to remind you of exactly. You were and exactly what that meant. Julian's shoes clicked against the marble as they walked. He was aware faintly in a way he chose not to examine that the sound was swallowed almost immediately by the space rather than echoing back with the satisfying resonance he might have expected. The building didn't amplify you up here. It absorbed you. A young woman in a gray blazer met them at the end of the hallway. She introduced herself as Diane, the chief prosecutor's assistant, with the polite efficiency of someone. Has spent years managing the logistics of high-stakes rooms. Through that experience, she had developed a specific immunity to the particular energy that men like Julian, Sterling, bring into a building. The energy of people. Believe the meeting has already been decided in their favor. "Chief Thorne will be with you shortly," Diane said. "I'll show you to the negotiation room." Sterling thanked her. Julian said nothing. He glanced at the framed photographs lining the wall of the corridor. Black and white images of the building's history past prosecutors' civic occasions. Decades of institutional gravity rendered in silver gelatin and cheap frames. He looked at them with the mild, dismissive attention of someone touring a museum they didn't choose to visit. The negotiation room was at the end of the hall behind a door that was heavy mahogany, dark and solid. The handle had been worn smooth by years of hands that had pressed it in states of hope, desperation, calculation. Occasionally something approaching genuine remorse. Diane opened it. She gestured them in. The room itself was not large. It was built with the specific proportions that make spaces feel larger than their measurements. High ceilings, a long rectangular table of dark wood, 8 chairs arranged with precise symmetry. A single window at the far end looked out over the city with the kind of unobstructed authority that reminded you, if you were the type to be reminded, that decisions made in this room had consequences extending well beyond its walls. On the table, 2 glasses, a pitcher of water, a clean legal pad at each end. Positioned at the head of the table with deliberate visibility, a small recording unit. Its red standby light blinked in steady, patient intervals. Julian looked at the recording unit. Then he looked away. He pulled out the chair on the near side of the table. Not the head, not deliberately subordinate, but the position of a man. Considers himself a peer in any room he enters. He sat down with the controlled ease he had practiced since adolescence. He understood that how you occupy a chair communicates something about whether you can be moved. He set his phone face down on the table. He considered for a moment putting his feet up. Then, in a small concession to Sterling's presence, he decided against it. Sterling took the chair beside him. He set his briefcase flat on the table. He opened it with 2 precise clicks. He removed a thin folder, a legal pad, and a pen. He arranged them with the methodical calm of a surgeon laying out instruments. Julian had always thought, an excellent lawyer, primarily because he appeared to experience no emotional weather whatsoever. No nerves, no excitement, no hesitation. Just the steady, professional application of intelligence to problem. "How long do these things usually take?" Julian asked. "Depends on the prosecutor," Sterling said. He uncapped his pen. "Chief Thorne has a reputation for being thorough. We go in prepared, we present the narrative we've discussed, we let me do the talking. We walk out with a deal that keeps you out of a cell." He paused. "Do you understand what I mean when I say let me do the talking?" "Yes," Julian said. "Because last time I asked you that, you didn't." Julian said nothing. He picked up his phone. He checked the screen out of habit. He set it back down. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, Cypress City moved through its ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Traffic, pedestrians, the distant sound of a siren fading east. Entirely indifferent to the 2 men sitting in the 14th floor negotiation room, believed each in his own particular way that the next hour would proceed according to their expectations. The recording unit blinked, steady, patient, waiting. Somewhere down the marble corridor, a door opened. Footsteps began. Measured, unhurried, the footsteps of a man who had somewhere specific to be. No anxiety whatsoever about arriving there. They grew gradually louder. Each step was distinct and deliberate against the marble floor. The pace suggested complete and utter ownership of the distance between wherever they started, wherever they were going. Julian reached up and straightened his collar one final time. The footsteps stopped outside the door. The handle turned. Pure entitlement. He actually believes his family's wealth can erase a serious crime like a spilled drink. If I were sitting in that prosecutor's chair, I would be counting the seconds to ruin his day. Imagine walking into a room expecting a friend, finding your worst enemy. The trap is officially sprung. The door opened without drama. That was the first thing. The absence of drama. Julian had half expected something he couldn't have named. Some atmospheric shift. A change in the quality of the light. The kind of cinematic weight that arrives with people. Carry real authority. Instead, the door simply opened the way doors do. A man walked in. The room changed anyway. Marcus Thorne in a courtroom suit was a different proposition entirely from Marcus Thorne in a faded denim jacket behind the wheel of a battered sedan. The charcoal was precise and dark-cut with the kind of understated exactness that communicated not wealth, something more durable than wealth. Taste, yes, but more than taste. Certainty. The certainty of a man who had worn this particular armor long enough that it had stopped being armor, had become simply himself. No tie pin, no pocket square, no ornamentation of any kind. Just the suit and the man inside it. The absolute gravitational stillness he brought into the room like a weather system. Sterling was on his feet before Marcus had fully crossed the threshold. It was automatic, instinctive. The physical response of a seasoned attorney. has spent 34 years reading rooms. He understood at a level below conscious thought. Deference is not merely polite, but structurally necessary. Chief Thorne, Sterling said, extending his hand. Harlan Sterling, thank you for making the time. Mr. Sterling, Marcus shook his hand once briefly with the economy of a man. Does not perform warmth he doesn't feel. His voice was even and low, the voice of someone who has spent decades in courtrooms, has learned that volume is the least reliable form of authority. Sit down, please. Julian had not stood. He became aware of this approximately 2 seconds after Sterling rose, in the way you become aware of a wrong note in a piece of music. Not the note itself so much as the silence that follows it, the moment when the room has heard something it wasn't supposed to hear. He started to push his chair back. Some instinct toward correction kicked in late. Then Marcus turned and looked at him directly for the first time. Julian Vance stopped moving entirely. The recognition was not instantaneous. It came in stages, the way cold water arrives. You lower yourself into it. First the temperature, then the understanding of the temperature, then the full body comprehension of what you have entered. Julian saw the face. He processed the face. And then something in his memory turned over slowly, like a page in a book being read in a language you're still learning. The face at the intersection of Oak and Fifth Avenue, older, calmer, behind a dusty windshield, watching him with that unreadable, unhurried stillness, assembled itself over the face in front of him now like a transparency laid over a photograph. The color left his face in a single visible wave. It started at his forehead and moved downward. The blood retreated from the skin with the speed of a tide going out, leaving behind a gray, stricken pallor that made him look suddenly very young. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hand, which had been resting on the table beside his phone, moved slightly. A small, involuntary motion as if reaching for something that wasn't there. Marcus did not react to this. He moved to the head of the table with the same measured, unhurried pace he'd used in the corridor. He set down the case file he'd been carrying. He pulled out the chair with both hands, positioning it with a quiet precision that suggested he had sat in this specific chair a great many times. He settled into it slowly. He placed the case file flat on the table in front of him. He folded his hands on top of it. And then he looked at Julian Vance with an expression that contained in its absolute neutrality something far more devastating than anger could have been. Recognition. Calm, complete, patient recognition. The look of a man regarding something he has already fully understood. The silence stretched. Sterling, who had reseated himself, was now observing Julian's transformation with the rapid, recalibrating attention of a man. Has just detected an unknown variable in an equation he thought he'd already solved. He leaned fractionally toward his client. Julian, he said quietly. The word was both a prompt and a warning. Julian said nothing. His jaw was working slightly, the muscles moving without producing sound, like a man trying to start an engine that won't catch. Marcus let the silence run for 10 more seconds. He did not fill it. He did not lean forward. He did not soften his posture. He did not offer any of the social lubricants that people use to ease the discomfort of difficult rooms. He simply sat, hands folded, eyes steady, in the absolute composure of a man who had been waiting 3 weeks. 22 years of professional patience for this precise moment. He had no intention of rushing it. Then he opened the case file. He did it slowly, the way you turn the first page of something you already know by heart. Intend to read aloud anyway, not for your own information, for the information of the room. He looked at the first page for a moment. His eyes carried the quality of eyes that are not reading so much as resting on a familiar surface. The mind attends to other things. Mr. Vance, Marcus said. His voice was the same, even low register it had been at the door. I understand you're here to discuss the matter of the Meridian District incident, the hit and run involving Carla Reyes. He paused one beat, not for effect but for precision, the pause of a man. Measures his words the way engineers measure load-bearing materials. 34 years old. Home health aide. She will not have full use of her left hand again. Julian made a sound. It was small and involuntary. It had no semantic content. Not a word, not quite a syllable. Just the auditory evidence of a human body encountering a magnitude it hadn't prepared for. Sterling's pen had stopped moving on his legal pad. He was looking at Marcus now with an expression that had traveled in the last 90 seconds from professional courtesy through careful reassessment. It was now somewhere in the territory of focused, unblinking attention. He was a man who prided himself on entering rooms fully informed. He was beginning to understand with the uncomfortable clarity of professional humiliation that he was not fully informed about this one. "Chief Thorne," Sterling began. His voice carried the measured confidence of a man who intends to re-establish the conversational architecture. "I appreciate your thoroughness. My client deeply regrets the incident involving Ms. Reyes, and I think if we examine the circumstances with appropriate—" "We'll get to Ms. Reyes," Marcus said. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said it. It landed in the room with a weight that ended Sterling's sentence as cleanly as a door closing. He kept his eyes on Julian. "First, I want to make sure we're all comfortable." He said the last word the way a geologist might say a rock formation's name, descriptively without attachment, simply identifying what is present. "Are you comfortable, Mr. Vance?" Julian's mouth opened. His voice, when it finally arrived, was a register higher than it had been 20 minutes ago in the elevator, thinned by something that had not been in it then. He stopped. He swallowed. The monogrammed cufflinks caught the overhead light as his hands moved to the edge of the table and gripped it. "I think there might be some—" "Take your time," Marcus said. He said it with perfect, terrible patience. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal suit. He withdrew his phone. He set it on the table between them with a soft, final click the way you place the last piece into a puzzle you've been assembling for a very long time. He did not press play. Not yet. He simply let it sit there, face up in the clean fluorescent light of the 14th floor, while Julian Vance stared at it with the expression of a man watching the walls of a room he thought was open discover themselves to be in fact a cell. Sterling recovered first. That was his professional gift. Not brilliance exactly, though he was undeniably intelligent, but recovery. The ability to absorb an unexpected variable, recalibrate in real time. Continue moving forward with enough composure that the recalibration itself remained invisible. 34 years of difficult rooms had built in him a kind of adaptive mechanism, one that functioned almost below the level of conscious thought. It engaged now with the smooth, automatic efficiency of something that has been used often enough to require no deliberate activation. He set his pen down on the legal pad. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at Marcus with the careful, leveled attention of a man who has just understood that the terrain is different from the map he was given, who is now reading the actual terrain with the full focus that survival requires. "Chief Thorne," Sterling said. His voice had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been perceptible to anyone, hadn't been listening closely. But the practiced warmth of the opening gambit was gone. It had been replaced by something more spare, more honest. The voice of a man setting aside a tool that is no longer useful. "I want to be straightforward with you." "I'd appreciate that," Marcus said. Sterling nodded once, a small, precise acknowledgement. "My client is 21 years old. He comes from a background that has, I think we can both acknowledge, not always provided him with the appropriate framework for understanding the real-world consequences of his actions. That is not an excuse. It is context. And in the matter of Ms. Reyes, whatever the specifics of that evening, I believe there is a genuine path to accountability that serves the interests of justice without—" "I'd like to play something for the room," Marcus said. Sterling stopped. It was not a rude interruption in the conventional sense. Marcus had not raised his voice, had not leaned forward, had not deployed any of the theatrical gestures that interruptions usually carry. He had simply spoken at the same even register he'd maintained since entering the room. The words had the effect of a very large, very quietly placed object, immovable, requiring attention, altering the space around it simply by being there. Sterling looked at the phone on the table. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A careful, rapid internal assessment, the kind that experienced attorneys perform constantly, invisibly, perpetually modeling outcomes and adjusting strategy in response to new information. He looked at the phone, then he looked at Julian. Julian was staring at the phone with the fixed, unblinking intensity of a man watching something approach from a distance he cannot calculate and cannot escape. "Of course," Sterling said. He said it the way you say "of course." You understand that the alternative is not available. Marcus picked up the phone. He turned it over in his hand once with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to everything in this room. He found the file. He pressed play. He set the phone back down in the center of the table. The recording opened with ambient sound. Traffic, the distant blare of a horn, the specific acoustic texture of an outdoor urban space captured on a phone microphone. And then Julian Vance's voice arrived. It filled the room. It was remarkable. Marcus had always thought what a recording did to a voice. In the moment of its original production, Julian's screaming had been diffused by open air, by distance, by the psychological noise of the situation itself. The shock of the crash, the gathering crowd, the adrenaline that narrows perception to its most immediate elements. Here, in a sealed room with high ceilings, hard surfaces with nothing to absorb or deflect it, the voice was naked, total, and fully itself. Every modulation of contempt. Every syllable of the racial insults arriving with the crisp, damning clarity of a sworn deposition. The sound of bills being thrown. Julian's laughter, a sound that had been performative in the open air of the street, calibrated for an audience, revealed itself here, stripped of its context, as something uglier and more precise. And then the voice said, "I have the Chief Prosecutor's office in my pocket." The room absorbed this. Sterling's hands, which had been resting flat on the table, moved. It was a small motion. He drew them back slowly by perhaps 3 inches. Then they were still again. But Marcus had been watching people's hands in negotiation rooms for 20 years. He did not miss it. Julian made no sound at all. The recording continued for another 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Marcus let it run to the end. I didn't watch Julian during the playback. He watched Sterling. Sterling was the more instructive subject, the one whose reactions were informed by professional comprehension rather than personal terror. His face was therefore a more accurate barometer of the legal weight of what the room was hearing, what Marcus saw on Sterling's face in those 2 minutes. 14 seconds was a sequence of internal events rendered in the most minimal possible external expression. The nearly imperceptible tightening around the eyes that indicated recognition. The slight downward movement of the corners of the mouth that indicated assessment. And finally, very briefly, something that in a less disciplined face might have been disgust. Restrained and professional, but present. Unmistakably present. Then Sterling drew it back behind the neutral mask of a man. Does not allow his personal reactions to enter the room where his professional ones are working. The recording ended. The ambient traffic sound cut off. The room was very quiet. Marcus picked up the phone. He set it back in his breast pocket. He looked at Sterling. Sterling looked back at him. In the silence between them, something was communicated that required no words. The mutual professional acknowledgement of 2 men. Understood the law well enough to know exactly what they had both just heard, what it meant and what it precluded. It was not a warm exchange. It was precise. The clarity of a shared technical language applied to an unambiguous situation. Then Sterling turned and looked at Julian. Julian was looking at the center of the table. His face had passed through several distinct phases during the recording. It had arrived somewhere difficult to categorize. Not quite shame, not quite fear, not quite the hot embarrassment of simple exposure. Something that combined elements of all 3. Added to them a quality of sheer vertiginous incomprehension. The expression of someone who has, for the first time in his life, encountered a consequence, a real one that did not dissolve on contact with his family's name. "Julian," Sterling said. Julian didn't look up. "Julian." Sterling's voice carried no warmth whatsoever now. It was the voice of a professional addressing a situation in purely professional terms from. All personal investment had been efficiently removed. "I need you to listen to me very carefully." Julian looked up. His eyes were glassy and slightly unfocused. The eyes of someone whose internal landscape has just undergone a rapid, disorienting reorganization. "The recording you just heard," Sterling said with the measured, almost clinical precision of someone delivering a diagnosis, "contains at minimum evidence of racial harassment, criminal threatening an admission of attempting to bribe an officer of the court in statements that directly contradict the character narrative I was preparing to present on your behalf. He paused for exactly 1 second. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Julian said nothing. Sterling nodded as though the silence itself was confirmation. He looked at Marcus for a moment, a look that carried in it the complex, uncomfortable content of professional respect for an adversary acknowledgement of a comprehensively lost position, something that might have been beneath the surface of everything else, a reluctant personal reckoning with the nature of the client he had agreed to represent. Then he reached out slowly and with absolute deliberateness, drew his briefcase toward him across the table, not dramatically, no sharp motion, no theatrical gesture, simply and finally the way you close a door on a room you are not returning to. He clicked the latches. He stood up. Chief Thorne, Sterling said, I owe you an apology, not on behalf of my client. That apology is his to make and his alone, but for my own role in bringing this meeting to your office without full knowledge of the relevant history. That was a failure of due diligence. I regret it. Marcus looked at him steadily. Sit down, Mr. Sterling. We're not finished. Sterling met his gaze. Something passed between them. Then Sterling set the briefcase back on the table. He unclicked the latches. He sat down. Julian was shaking now. It was barely visible. A fine, continuous tremor in his hands and the set of his jaw. But in the silence of the room, it was the most present thing, the only thing that was still moving. Marcus turned to him. He did not lean forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not change his posture in any way that suggested that what was about to happen required additional force or gravity beyond what was already present in the room. He simply looked at Julian Vance the way a man looks at something he has already completely decided and opened the case file to the second page. He opened the case file to the second page. He began. Sterling stood up 11 minutes into Marcus's presentation of the charges. He did it without drama, the way he had done everything in this room once the recording had played. Quietly, finally, with the economical precision of a man who has located the exact boundary of what his professional integrity will permit, has decided without apparent hesitation to stand on the correct side of it. He had listened to 11 minutes of Marcus laying out the case with the methodical, unsparing thoroughness of someone. Has not left a single element to chance. The hit and run, the flight from the scene, the phone records placing the call to Sterling before any call to emergency services, the witness statements from the Meridian District crossing, the traffic camera footage, the recording, the original incident at Oak. Fifth never reported, now being formally entered into the record as a separate criminal matter. He had listened to all of it. At the 11-minute mark, he picked up his pen. He capped it. He placed it parallel to the edge of his legal pad with the careful alignment of a man performing a small, deliberate act of closure. Chief Thorne, Sterling said, I need to formally withdraw as counsel for Mr. Vance, effective immediately. Marcus looked up from the file. I am unable to continue representation in this matter, Sterling said. His voice was even professional entirely without the self-protective hedging that lesser attorneys employed in moments of strategic retreat. There was no pretense that the withdrawal was procedural, no manufactured ambiguity about the reasoning. The evidence you've presented combined with information I was not provided prior to accepting this case creates a conflict that I'm not able to reconcile with my obligations as an officer of this court. He paused. I'll be filing the formal notice of withdrawal by end of business today. He looked at Julian then. The look was brief and without cruelty, but it contained in its very brevity a verdict, not a legal verdict, something more personal than that. The judgment of a man who has made a career of defending the indefensible and has, in the course of 34 years, developed a private taxonomy of what he will and will not carry out of a room on behalf of another human being. Julian Vance in that taxonomy had just been recategorized. I'd strongly recommend you secure new representation before any further proceedings, Sterling said to Julian. Then he picked up his briefcase. He nodded once to Marcus with the respectful formality of a professional acknowledging a superior performance. He walked to the door. His footsteps crossed the marble hallway and diminished. Then the elevator at the end of the corridor made its sound. Then there was silence. Julian was alone. He sat very still for a moment as though Sterling's departure had disrupted some load-bearing element of his composure. He was testing carefully whether the structure would hold without it. It did not hold. The tremor that had been barely visible in his hands during the recording spread now quietly and completely. Julian Vance, 21 years old, heir to a real estate empire, wearer of a Brioni suit. Monogrammed platinum cufflinks put both palms flat on the mahogany table. He looked at Marcus Thorne with eyes that had lost in the last 40 minutes every last vestige of the performative certainty that had animated them for as long as he could remember. "Mr. Thorne," Julian said. His voice was unrecognizable from the voice on the recording. That voice had been loud, fluent, absolutely convinced of its own invulnerability. This voice was thin, stripped of its register. The voice of someone speaking from a place that has had everything architectural removed from it, is discovering for the first time what remains underneath. He stopped. He tried again. "I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know who you were." Marcus looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "I know," Marcus said. The simplicity of it landed in the room with more weight than an accusation would have. Julian blinked. Something in his face cracked open. Not dramatically, not with the clean release of genuine catharsis, but in the jagged, graceless way of someone. Has never learned to cry in front of other people because there have never been consequences serious enough to require it. "Please," Julian said. The word came out small and naked. "Please, whatever you need, I'll make it right. I have money, I can—" He caught himself. The color that had flooded back into his face during his breakdown retreated again as he heard his own sentence. He understood, arriving at the comprehension approximately 3 weeks too late, what it sounded like, who he was saying it to. Marcus let the silence hold for 5 seconds. "Mr. Vance," he said. His voice had not changed register. It had not acquired any of the heat that the moment might have licensed. It was the same, even low, absolute voice it had been since he walked through the door. "Carla Reyes is 34 years old. She will not have full use of her left hand for the rest of her life. She has a 7-year-old daughter. She has medical bills that will take her years to resolve. She has lost income she cannot recover." He paused, not for effect. For the specific weight that a pause carries. It is placed between a fact and its consequence. Her life was altered permanently because you made a series of choices over the course of one evening that you did not believe would ever reach you. Julian's breathing was audible now, shallow and uneven. "They've reached you," Marcus said. He turned the case file to the final page. The charges were listed in clean, unsparing legal language. Felony hit and run, failure to render aid, leaving the scene of an accident resulting in serious bodily injury, criminal threatening, attempted bribery of a public official, reckless endangerment. Below the charges, the sentencing recommendations. Calculated without reduction for a plea, without mitigation for cooperation, without any of the procedural generosities that the system extended to people, came to its table before the table came to them. "I am not offering a plea agreement," Marcus said. "I am not reducing the charges. I am not negotiating the sentencing recommendations. You will face every count in open court with the full weight of the evidence that exists. Is, as you've heard this afternoon, considerable." He closed the file. "You have the right to secure new legal representation before proceedings begin. I'd suggest you do that quickly." Julian's mouth was open. The tears that had threatened during his apology had arrived now. They ran silently, without dignity, down his face, dropping onto the lapel of the Brioni suit. "Is there anything I can do?" Julian whispered. Marcus looked at him for the last time with the same expression he had maintained throughout. Not cold, not triumphant, not vindictive, simply clear. The expression of a man who has looked at a situation completely, seen it for exactly what it is. He is not required to feel anything about it beyond the professional obligation to address it correctly. "Yes," Marcus said. "You can think about Carla Reyes." He gathered the case file. He straightened it against the table once. He stood. He buttoned his jacket with 2 precise movements. He picked up his phone from the breast pocket. He confirmed the recording was secure. He replaced it. Then Marcus Thorne walked to the door of the negotiation room. He opened it. The marble hallway received him. His footsteps moved away from the room at the same measured, unhurried pace they had arrived with. the footsteps of a man who had somewhere specific to be, had been there completely and was now finished. Behind him in the negotiation room, the guards who had been waiting in the corridor entered, spoke to Julian Vance in the standard language of custody and procedure. Julian listened with the hollow-gutted compliance of someone for whom language itself has become recently unreliable. The recording unit on the table blinked twice and went dark. In the elevator going down. Marcus stood with his hands at his sides. His eyes were on the middle distance. His breathing was even, the way Earl had always told him to breathe. Something hard was over, not with relief, not with triumph, but with the quiet, grounded steadiness of a man. Had done the thing that was required of him and would now return without ceremony to the work that remained. There was always more work. The elevator opened onto the lobby. Rodriguez was waiting by the door, keys in hand. He looked up when Marcus emerged. "Ready, sir." Marcus put on his jacket. He looked briefly at the afternoon light coming through the lobby's glass doors. He nodded. "Take me to the office," he said. "I have paperwork."
Pure entitlement. He actually believes his family's wealth can erase a serious crime, like a spilled drink. If I were sitting in that prosecutor's chair, I would be counting the seconds to ruin his day. Imagine walking into a room, expecting a friend, finding your worst enemy. The trap is officially sprung.